Welcome to the final episode of Series 68, everybody. In today's episode, we get into our discussion for Life on the Edge with our guest, Maso Perez. But before we get into that, here's what to expect in our calls to action. After the show, we get back to most of our normal announcements. I am here by myself again, due to life being life, so I'll have my final thoughts on this game and this series before diving into all of that. Until then, enjoy the show, everyone.
Welcome back to our discussion episode. Last time we finished our session 0 for Life on the Edge. This episode will be discussing the character creation process. We're excited to welcome back Maso Perez. Do you want to reintroduce yourself to everyone? And then please tell us about the character that you made on our last episode.
Yeah, for sure. So, as Dave said, I am Maso Perez, and I am an emerging writer and game designer. Worked with Kitfox Games to make Life on the Edge recently. And I'm queer, I'm Latino, and also I made a silly little guy named Diego. So we did random generation for those who weren't there, and I ended up getting a blade. So I decided to make a classic chivalric longsword with identity issues, because most people consider that a boring weapon. I don't personally, but most people do. And yeah, he's the son of a local priest in a medieval village who can transform into a longsword, is fairly well balanced at a variety of tasks, but as a result, lacks a real, solid core of his identity that helps drive him and make him feel like he's worthwhile. So, yeah.
Ryan, please tell us about your character.
So, my character is Callie Flaz, or Cal, or Callie for short, depending on how you want to go about it. Any pronouns for them. They are the quintessential surfer wizard.
Yeah, every game has. Yeah.
Like
that well-known trope, surfer wizard.
This is a well-known surfer wizard trope. Magnificent, majestic hair, very honest, basically like the laid-back himbo type that actually will philosophize and have intelligent thoughts within them, but it does not seem that way when you're casually meeting them at all. They have a NPC link with a sentient therapy journal, which I love. So they'll write in the journal, and the journal will help back by writing back, I think. I think it's like a writing conversation.
Yeah, that's how I pictured it. Yeah. Not
a speaking. So I'll write something and then I'll get a response in writing below in a different handwriting, which sounds really evocative. And they're the ones that helping me feel confident enough to face my problems, which is nice. And Califlaz turns into a gemstone that can be affixed to a staff or another type of weapon or whatever, or just held, that also manipulates water. And I'm able to blow up groups of enemies very loudly and kind of pull them where I want them.
Yeah.
As you do.
Yeah. That's again, a very common wizard trope.
Yes. As a surfer wizard, I go with the flow in both my combat as well as my existence.
Beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I am none of those things.
I know. Go ahead and tell us about your character, Amelia.
Yeah, my character is Lilith, who also becomes a dark energy whip. Lilith is ambitious, diligent, but also has like a general discomfort about the state of the world, let's say, about the system of authority that we all live under. But she doesn't know that. She doesn't know that like that's where her frustration is coming from. You know, friends with a local group of like, how do we describe them? They're not really like witches themselves. Yes,
keepers of the old ways.
Yes,
maybe.
yeah, but also kind of showy and wants everybody to know what she's doing, but also apparently being hunted by witch hunters. So not subtle for her own safety at all.
Amazing.
Should we talk about our connections a little bit too?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So with Califlaz, I am connected to you, Diego, where we knew each other just kind of in passing, and we kind of didn't really meet like in person until we started working together.
It makes sense when you consider that I am the secret child of the local priest and you're a surfer wizard. We would like, I'm going to hear about the surfer wizard, but I don't know if I'm allowed to talk to him, to be completely honest.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know, let's see, Diego and I, we were like incompatible, right? That was our thing.
We're a little bit afraid of each other, basically. Like, both, you're basically like the scion of the keepers of the old ways and kind of represent a rebellious counterculture almost.
Right.
Well,
Diego,
well,
and I have like this like dark energy thing going on too.
Yeah.
Which very much clashes with your priestly upbringing.
And romantic weapon form, right? Like it is the medieval weapon as far as most people are concerned.
And I'm not a big fan of feudalism.
Yeah. I mean, neither is Diego, but he hasn't figured that out yet. Very repressed young man who may not even be a man in the long run. We'll never see.
Find out.
We would have.
We will not find out.
We still got a fanfic section.
That's true. And then Califlaz and I have some. I have some resentment toward Califlaz because you're kind of like conflict avoidant. Right, like you don't enjoy conflict, whereas because I am very showy and like I'm very proud of the fact that I am a weapon, and so I'm like, let's get into it, let's do it, and you're like,
and I think secretly Califlaz has a little bit of resentment towards your character as well because of that showiness, right?
Right. Well, it's like definitely not safe. Like we've determined it's not safe to be showy.
Yeah.
You know, so I am like definitely putting you in danger also. Yeah.
So pretty tense connections between the three characters, but
we did not get any nice ones really. Like the best one was like, I don't really know who you are.
Exactly.
But none of us are self-hating as a result of being weapons, of being magical weapon people.
Right.
None of us, we all have a common cause, right? And at the end of the day, I don't think that any of these characters would like hate each other, but probably that would start off with quite a bit of hesitance and that there would just be something between you two that would lead to an argument eventually. Right.
Yeah. There's unresolved conflict, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
It is ripe for like good drama at the beginning and like good character growth potential.
Yeah. That first sort of like downtime conversation is going to be,
interesting.
A rough one.
Yeah, absolutely. And like this is the type of like role play that I would love to see where like it does start off rough and slowly you build those bridges,
right?
And actually like, you know, that there's a reason why the enemies to lovers trope is like so juicy, right?
Yeah,
because I hate you, but then actually I love you, right?
Right. It combines both of our favorite things, which is I love conflict. I love when like characters are at odds, like within a party. And Ryan is just like, I love when everyone is like friends and pals. And so
it's also
I get to start, you get to end.
Yeah. And it also is like so common in romance, but also in just general like stories about relationships, I think, because it marks always as an improvement, right?
Right.
Whereas,
yeah, it's
like,
growth.
you can feel so bitter about the idea of starting as friends and having a falling out, right? And breaking up. Whereas, like, if you start off on just the wrong foot and then improve, it's so much more like, oh, I'm so happy with how this turned out. Yeah.
Nowhere to go but up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and dive right into a segment that we are calling D20 for your thoughts.
D20 for your thoughts?
So in this segment, we like to talk to our guests about their thoughts on the character creation process in this game and other games in general. Before we start, the most quintessential cliche question of RPG podcasting, we have to get it out of the way. How did you get into RPGs? How did it come to this?
So one of the funny things is that you could argue I never wasn't in RPGs in the sense that, like, if we just talk about role-playing is definitely a thing that just all kids do at some point, right? And I never really stopped, to a degree that it was one of the things that hurt my social status as like a tween, you know? But what basically happened is, like, I'd always been super into those kinds of imagination games. I was always writing my own little canons and stories and characters. And when I was about 12, my cousin introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons. And in addition to that, when I was about 14, a classmate introduced me to online, like, private message role-playing and
like play-by-post kind of,
like those MUDs and whatnot, too.
Yeah. And so I got familiar with, like, simultaneously very character-driven, very, like, loose narrative role-playing, and also was learning about, like, tactical combat and all of that through 3.5 edition, which is, like, the edition that you either hate the most or love the most of D&D.
Right, yeah. So you had, like, a well-rounded education in that intro period.
I got like, lucky. But the other thing that happened is that for a good gap of, like, until I was, like, 16, maybe, nobody I knew played tabletop RPGs regularly. So the only way I could play is I had to GM for my younger siblings and cousins. Because those were the only people who wanted to play with me. And the only way we would get it done is if I GM'd it. And that led into, obviously, like, if you're GMing from such a young age and everything, you get really used to the systems, how they work. You start making your own homebrew, especially in, like, Dungeons and Dragons, where you want to regularly be in your own fantasy setting if you can. And then it also led to a severe frustration with Dungeons and Dragons that eventually led into me making my own games, because Dungeons and Dragons hates game masters. It hates you. It thinks you should do all the work for them, basically, unless you want to run the most, like, straightforward, typical D&D game possible. If you want to do anything interesting, they're like, all right, here's a bunch of calculations we're not going to teach you how to do. Figure it out, right?
Right.
So, like, there was a lot of stuff like that that frustrated me beyond belief. And initially, I started moving into really crunchy games that had better math, that was easier to tell what was going on, and you could design things for. You know, the fusion system that uses metric math. It's always in tens, so that makes it a lot easier to organize your thoughts around it.
Right.
But then, Powered by the Apocalypse games came out, and they hit me like a truck. I had never seen a game where not only were so many of the rules just on the character sheet, which was so helpful and convenient, but also just that, like, you could play it so fast, you could get so much narrative potential out of it. And although I have a lot of respect for a lot of different types of game systems, Powered by the Apocalypse right now kind of owns my heart. So everything I've been making has been either like a derivative or heavily inspired by that. And I've just been making free RPGs like crazy whenever I feel like it. I mentioned off camera, I think, off the recording, that I made a harem anime game where you all play as different romantic interests for the protagonist like character who's boring and no one wants to be them anyway. And that character is run by the GM. That game I wrote in a fugue state in 6 hours one Saturday morning when I woke up at 4 a.m. And I just had the idea. So I just wrote from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. and I wrote and made the whole thing in all one sitting. Wild. So like, it's definitely a fixation of mine and something I would like to turn into a larger career if I can. But in this case, I had made a fan game for Boyfriend Dungeon, the video game, which I really, really loved and I thought had a lot of narrative potential for something like a tabletop game. And then about, I don't know, in July or so, I messaged Kitfox Games and it was just really lucky timing where they were looking for someone to make a Boyfriend Dungeon RPG after they had an issue with like a past writer or something, or it just kind of fell off. But so I got really lucky that way and we did a collaboration and here we are with my first arguably published, not self-published tabletop RPG.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's exciting.
Cool.
I love that, like, it was just like a constant, we've had a lot of guests on that are like, oh yeah, I started playing in high school or like, as a kid with some friends and then I stopped playing for 10 years and that, so I love that yours just like keeps going all the way through.
Escapist fantasies were always a major part of my life. I think that it's partly how I organize my thoughts, like running through multiple scenarios. And that includes in a kind of like world building way where sometimes it's easier for me to understand, like, if I was learning biology in school, it might be easier for me to picture how a thing that works about an animal would work on like a dragon. And that would help me wrap my head around it as a kid, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've always been playing make-believe, and this is just the adult way to do it.
Right. Yeah. It's just like now we've put rules on, what you're, Well, I think Ryan and I can both say too that like, we've played a little bit with our kids too. And like, I love that about playing with kids is that like they don't have those same limits on like imagination. So you're like, what do you want to do? And they're like, I want to do this and this and that. Because it's like nobody's ever been like, can I do that? Do the rules let me? They're just like, nope, here's what's going to happen. And there's blue Jello at the birthday party. Like it's okay.
It's wonderful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it sucks because we lose some of that as adults. And so
wouldn't even need the character narrative prompt system for kids for this game. You could just ask them like, what weapon do you want to be? And they'd come up with a whole person.
Yeah, you're like, tell me about it. Yep.
Absolutely. Well, in your opinion, then, what makes for a great character creation system? Like, what sort of components of character creation do you like a lot when a system includes it?
So I don't want to give too wishy-washy of an answer here, because I do genuinely think that like different systems can always have different things that I would hate in another system, but I love in this one, right?
Yeah.
But
context matters a lot.
Yeah.
I think the core of what makes a good character creation system, to me personally, is that the process of creating the character actually helps you create multiple facets of the character at once, everything that's important to the game. So like a common frustration with something like a D&D, especially like some of the older editions, is that you're not really making a character. You're making a fighting style.
Yeah,
and then you're expected to just write stuff around it. And, you know, in things like OSR, with the way that they play the game, it's understandable, and I'm not trying to knock on that. But me personally, I always prize when a game, as I'm making decisions, I'm already forming in my head who this person is. And that really helps to me to get into the character, because there is no such a thing as a blank slate character. You can't play one. You're going to at least default to something you tend to like. But for me, that's why I love Powered by the Apocalypse games, because it always felt like you're just filling in boxes usually rather than writing down whole abilities and whatever. But the choices of which boxes and how many boxes and, you know, like, well, this playbook lets me change these stats, but this playbook doesn't let me do that. Why is that? And you're like, it's almost like you're figuring out how the system itself works in the process. That's what I like about Powered by the Apocalypse. And in addition to that, with a game like games that have the life path system for the super crunchy simulationist games, I love that they help us like find out like that when I was 10, I fell on a rock and lost an intelligence point. But that's really not only funny, but also now I can have a mark on my character's head. And I can have a bunch of people making assumptions about him being dumb because of that incident, even if he still has a good intelligence score, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
like,
or the idea that too, that you can be like tell everybody it's like this ridiculous battle scar that you have on your face, but really it's because you fell and hit a rock. Like,
exactly.
You know, like you get so much from that little
you just
bit.
need just enough. But like, it needs to match the game. So in this game, I tried my best to create a system where it feels like as you're making decisions about who the wielder is, it's also informing your weapon form to some degree, and vice versa. And that was like a major goal for me. And also one of the things that I love the most about character creation is when it really just feels like I'm not just making a character, but I'm like designing one as I go.
Yeah. Yeah, I like when you come out with something that is like fully playable, because like certainly you can come out with stats and you can play the game, but like that role playing part isn't there. So I love when it has, you know, like anything that has even just like a few of those questions. I like ones that are like sort of evocative questions that are like, you can answer this in really any way that you want. But yeah, it leaves it open to like actually have something like fully playable when you get to the table.
Yeah, and by extension, like, again, not because I don't want to knock on OSR. There's an OSR game called, I think it's called Beyond the Wall. But
yeah, Ryan loves that game.
Love it.
So, you know, the character creation in that, it's not like stripped down just a stat block character creation. You really are making a character every time you make a character in Beyond the Wall.
Yeah.
And even in OSR, where you want that emergent gameplay and everything like that, an emergent story, you still can have your cake and eat it too in that way. You can still have character creation that really brings it in.
So we like to talk about the character sheets because essentially this is a character creation podcast. These ones definitely have like a very much like a playbook style layout with like kind of checking boxes and, you know, a little bit of fill in the blank and stuff. I'm interested to know also though how these were kind of designed in conjunction with like the way that you'd play the video game too. Like, is this, again, like not having played it personally, like how did that influence some of the decisions that you made there?
So originally, like, I'm not a graphic designer, right? So basically what happened with it, which is pretty funny, is that they had an artist working on both the art pieces and the overall layout of the book. And for them, they asked, like, do you have like a general guide to laying out for the character sheet? And I literally just made it in MS Paint, just to show like weapon moves go here kind of boxes, right? But ideally what I was trying to do was I wanted one that was very forward facing, one single page, simple, straightforward, right? We include a single blank page just in case anybody wants to print one out and add extra details or something to that degree. And I really just didn't want it to be intimidating. I wanted it to feel very like, oh, I can look at this and I know what this all means for the most part.
Yeah.
And like, I'm never like squinting and looking around at my character sheet to figure out which stat is where or whatever.
Right.
So there's a few things though that come to mind in my opinion. The first is that the narrative boxes are not too big. So it very much encourages that although you should have narrative elements to your character, they do not need to be written down. You don't need a giant backstory section. Right. Because often in my experience anyways, any RPG that comes with a big backstory section, none of my players have ever written a single word in that thing. They always will write it on a separate document if they feel like writing a backstory. They do not touch that because it's going to be too small a space anyway.
Yeah.
So
and a lot of times, like once you get into gameplay too, it's like the stuff I thought was going to be super important ended up not being important, or you know, the opposite, whatever. Yeah.
So like obviously we have a big space for your name and anything else that you want to put at the very top, right? And then we have the three major boxes of like how to picture your character in their wielder form. You have your vibe, which is like who you are as a person. you have your vibe, which is obviously like how you picture and experience a character. It's a very casual term, but at the end of the day, it is referring to like, well, how do I feel when I see or talk to or engage with this person, right? What do I feel about them? You have your struggles, which is probably the largest box, and it's because it is the thing that you would want the most detail in. And then you have your links, which is just big enough that you can make a nice comprehensive list of characters and the number that goes with them. And if you want, maybe add a detail about like what type of relationship it feels like. Below that, we have the character stats. And probably the most notable thing about this is how break is separated by a wall, like break and fear. And it's meant to do that so that it's extremely clear to anybody looking at this page that when you look at that, you know that break is not the same type of stat as the other ones. And that fear and this whole thing is its own little kind of closed system that does not interact with the others as directly as they interact with each other. Advances are there for you to read later, but it's also small enough that the idea is hopefully most people will just kind of scan over it. And then on the right-hand side is everything to do with the weapon. And I really wanted to make sure that on the left-hand side was all of the wielder stuff, and on the right-hand side was all of the weapon stuff, so that you think about your person, and then you think about what they turn into, right? And then in typical Powered by the Apocalypse fashion, it's like underlying, putting dots next to things, filling in boxes. But also, ideally at least, you don't need to know too much about your weapon beyond what it is, right? If somebody wants to do art of their weapon, they can do it, but you don't need to. And then in addition to that, you can also have just choose out the things that come with this playbook, leave enough space for there to be more to be filled in later. And then I wanted the majority of the playbook the weapon type technically, to be filled with the weapon moves, just so that when a player looks at it, the first thing that they can feel like is kind of like like almost like a buffet, you know? That's one of the other things that I love about Powered by the Apocalypse, where you don't have to cross-section multiple documents to figure out what your options are at level 1, right? It just says right at the top, pick 2, and you see all these options, and you get to read through them, and hopefully they evoke a movement or a special attack or a cool, like, you know, narrative aspect of how your character fights. And that by just filling in those boxes, you get a feel for who they are and what they're going to be like in, you know. Well,
and I like to, I mean, it's a thing with Powered by the Apocalypse games, and then a few others that I've seen too, is that like the description of those moves is right there on the page. Which means that, like, I as a player do not have to constantly have the book in front of me all the time to be flipping back and being like, okay, like, what does that, you know, like that spell or whatever, like, do? And I have to go back and find the exact wording of, like, what does it add +1 to? And when do I get to use it? And, you know, like, having all of that right on the sheet for me, especially as, like, a neurodivergent person who's like, I can't focus on too many, you know, it's like, oh, it's right there. I know what I need to do. And then, like, when I'm making my choices as I'm playing the game, it's very easy for me to look at my sheet and say, oh, this does this thing right now, rather than just having a name of it and being like, what does that even do? I got to go over here. Is that what I want to do? It just, like, moves play faster, too.
Yeah, and ideally, we're thinking possibly in the future, we might try to redesign and make a kind of, like, 2-page character sheet, where it also has all of the edges and flaws right there, and maybe a little bit of references to, like, which moves are part of which part of the game, right? But generally speaking, most of the rules, at least most of the rules specific only to you, are right there for you to grab, right? And that is just, like, a huge boon, because you can just hand it to almost anybody who's willing to play a tabletop game, and they're not going to get lost in boxes and scores most of the time. So yeah,
very cool. Well, how do we think character creation in Life on the Edge stacks up to other systems that we've played?
I mean, you guys should tell me that first before I answer.
I mean, it definitely has those sort of like PBTA playbook kind of feels, especially like with the moves, that it's like those are kind of specific to your class or, you know, type of weapon or whatever. I also really like, you know, kind of roll it. I love a good table to roll on. Like I will, if there's an option to roll on a table, I will do it. Like Ryan and I have a series of episodes where we just pulled random tables from a bunch of different games and then like rolled on them to like, we rolled to see which table you roll on and then like made random characters and like tried to make it all go together from like a whole variety of games. So like,
and somehow it works.
It does. I will always roll on a table. But I love that, like, you know, there's sort of these, you know, like one sentence kind of questions rather than just like, okay, I rolled and now I have this thing. And it's like, okay, but like, what is that? You know, like what is, it's a question of like, okay, you have a big thing that you're kind of vaguely afraid of. And, you know, then it's like, okay, well, what is that for me? And I felt they were like really evocative questions.
Yeah. I never would have gotten Sentient Therapy Journal as an NPC that I interact with on the regular unless if it wasn't for those random tables. Right. Because I like rolled this, like this character gets you through everything and like you would have been lost without them. And it's like, okay, well, let's lead into something a little unorthodox.
Yeah.
Sentient Journal. Why not?
Why not? Yeah. I mean, I think even our connections too, because I think a lot of us like sort of naturally being like, okay, well, somebody has to be the weapon. Somebody has to, like, I think we sort of would have leaned into the like, oh, okay, we're friends and that's how we got here. But having those options to have kind of like, you know, negative relationships too, to start, like really defined a lot about our group.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also tried my best. That you might have noticed that even the generation tables are often 2d6. And the reason I like 2d6 so much is because the most common thing you'll roll on it is 7. It's actually a sloping statistical one where everything in the middle is more likely than the things on the ends. So you can put really extreme options on the ends that the vast majority of players won't be bothered by getting. But then when you do roll those, it feels very special because it's like, ooh, I rolled snake eyes. What is the snake eyes option? It's like the most negative thing on the entire thing. And you're like, ooh, but it doesn't feel the same way as like when you're rolling a very swingy die, like a D20, where that's just as likely to happen as something more normal, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, and then the order, like statistically, because of those things, the order that you put them on the table very much matters too. Then it's not like, you know, it's like 2 is one extreme and then 12 is the other extreme. Whereas like certainly in designing the game, you could have just like put them in a random order and been like, oh, see what you get. Like, you know, like 12 and 11 are totally the opposite thing. And, you know, so like, I think that's definitely a smart design move that I don't know that a lot of people we've had plenty of guests who are like, I love the statistical analysis of what kind of die you're going to roll for what thing. And, you know, but like, it's, you know, one of those sort of like behind the scenes things that you're like, oh, I didn't just make a list and put it in order. I put the like sort of more like normal options kind of in the middle so that the more extreme dice rolls get you more extreme results.
Yeah. And like when I was designing everything for this specific game system, I really just wanted it to feel like nothing is ever confining, right?
Yeah.
That was a really big part for me. I really wanted it to be like, I'm making my guy kind of vibe. And like one of the things that like people always say is that I think this was a saying by Gary Gygax or something. But I remember that somebody once said, the biggest secret of tabletop RPGs that people should know is that you can play them without any rules. Right? You don't need a game. You don't need to buy a game to play a tabletop game. But having it is a prompt, right? At the end of the day, having it is like one thing that we are all choosing to accept, and we are accepting this system. And so to me, that's how I want to build the games, where like it's not there to tell you what to do or what fiction is correct, right?
Yeah.
But more so to kind of guide you and prompt you in the direction of what the game is fundamentally built for.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, we've
That's-
talked several times on our show about like this concept of like scaffolding is that it's just like it's this sort of frame to help you figure out, because like when you sit down and you're just like come up with something, it's overwhelming and like you don't,
Yeah.
you know, so it is helpful to have those, you know, like those questions and those rules to kind of be like, here's the, you know, the general vibe, the direction that we're going. So like we're all kind of on the same page of what we're doing. And then it's easier to kind of like play within those confines, because it can be like just as hard to have no rules as it can be to have too many.
The
Absolutely.
medicine to choice paralysis, basically.
Right. Yes.
But that's also kind of the problem when, like you're saying, if you have too many rules, the choice paralysis comes back again.
Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
now there's too many things to determine and think about. I get a deep sense of anxiety when I'm playing a 5th edition game, because I refuse to run it anymore, but I'll still play if a friend wants to run it. And whenever I play it, I get a deep anxiety every time I'm making a character, because I'm like, there's such a mentality, especially in Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of D20 systems, of you built your character wrong.
Yes, that like min-maxing and even just like it making sure that like this ability goes with this thing, because if you do it wrong, like it eventually kind of becomes unplayable.
Yeah. Yep. And so I was trying my best to have a Powered by the Apocalypse game with more combat complexity than most of them, because a lot of them reduce it to a single roll. Yeah. So I still wanted it to be something where like, this is a dungeon crawler. We want a dungeon crawl, right?
And if you're playing as a weapon, you want to like have combat. You want to know that like weapons. Me being a whip rather than a sword makes the character feel different when we fight, right? But at the same time, I wanted it to feel as not confining as possible, to such a degree that like a spear and a dagger are the same weapon type in this system, because they both stab. And that's all that it takes to be a specific type. It's just, how do you deal your damage? Shield is actually one of the most fun ones to make, because it's just a giant upset to that mentality to begin with, because it's the only weapon that isn't a weapon. I don't know, if you hit someone hard enough.
That's what it's based around.
If you try hard and believe in yourself.
But yeah. So
I
I'm
think
glad
that
to hear you guys like it.
Scaffolding is always really important for me in games, because I can't like no.
Yeah.
But I also think enough. You know, you talked about like having the right kind of feel for like the game that you're playing too, like that difference between OSR and then like Powered by the Apocalypse too. And I think I've probably talked about it on the show before too, but like it's one of the things that I look at when I'm judging games for the Annie Awards too, is that like, okay, what does this game say that it's about and supposed to, and then like, do the mechanics support you doing those things? Because that is really important. And like, again, it's why mechanics matter, because as my catchphrase is, you can't play everything in 5e. There are just things that those kinds of games don't do. You know, we talked about that downtime thing, that like, you know, repairing relationships and some, you know, that's something I as a player can bring to those games, but that's not what the game isn't doing that, you know? Yeah. And so I love, especially in character creation, the way that it like kind of reinforces like that bond between you and your weapon, like my personality and my weapon kind of going together, you know, like Ryan, you decided on this sort of like surfer vibe too, and that very much helped you pick like what exactly does my weapon actually do. Yeah. And so I feel like that kind of connection, at least in the character part that we've seen, feels like it's really there, that like the mechanics support what the game is supposed to be doing, like where the fun is supposed to be.
I'm happy to hear that it genuinely does feel like it's
Come
doing
sit down on our show and we'll tell you what we love about your game. That's our favorite part. Is like, let me tell you why it's great.
Keep stroking that ego.
We're glad to help. Glad to help. It is a thing that guests have said in the past. They're like, I like just sitting down and letting you tell me what's great about this. It's like, that's what I'm here for. Love it. Love it. So we've actually, I feel like, kind of covered this one already. We always ask, like, how does this reinforce the feel of the game and expectations for play? I say all the time, character creation is generally the first interaction players have with a game. Like when you sit down and you're starting to play a new RPG, character creation is the first time that you like touch on those rules. So the question then is like, what is this, like, how does this set your expectations for what playing the game is like? How does this inform us of like what we're actually going to be doing?
Mm-hmm.
So were there certain like things that you were like, this needs to be part of creation because it's going to be part of the game, or things that you left out, like specifically to kind of set that feel?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things that you can see as like a trend in games that prioritize it that way is that the chapters in the book literally will go like introduction, character creation, then the rules, right?
Yep.
There's a variety of games, and some games prefer to put the rules up front first so that you can read through them and then read the character creation. But I still find that myself and most of my friends tend to go right to character creation chapters when we're checking out a new RPG, because it's like, what does it feel like to do this? What does it feel like? What am I making here? Right?
Yeah. What are all these things in the rules even for?
Yeah. And as you guys said, you really like, your random tables. And I used to be a bit of a bit negative towards them almost, right? But at the same time, when I got into like life path related systems, life path completely turned my brain around on it. And I think it's because it was going from random generation tables that give you like, this is what happens, right? Versus random generation tables that say something like this happened. Tell us about it, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it's very much a difference between like kind of opening the possibility for a direction and then being like, here's what it is. And yeah, I don't like that, like you roll it and now it's your thing and you have it and you're like, but that has nothing to do with what I wanted to play. Yeah.
And like, I think that there was kind of an undercurrent of duality in everything about the way that the character creation was formed, because we start off on just a page describing character creation. And if you actually read the page in the book, it's mostly me in the text reassuring people, make your decisions. You can do this. You got this. Like, there's no wrong answers here. Don't worry about it. Right? Like, that's all it really is. It's just a page of like, have fun with this. Enjoy it. Do this thing. If you want to do a sci-fi weapon and another person really wants to do a fantasy weapon, they're both in the same setting now. Congrats. Don't worry about it. Right? And then immediately after that, we go into the narrative prompts. And this is where the first part of the duality creeps in, where we're thinking about the narrative and the mechanics as slightly separate, but complementary. They relate to each other, but at the same time, put the mechanics aside, focus on this. And like you guys said, I think it's because ultimately, I know that it's the first impression. I don't want my character creation to be somebody immediately reading a rule and getting confused. And I also don't want rules to be before my character creation, because then it's like, oh, I have to read all of this just to understand how to make something in this. Whereas if you start with the narrative, then you're already just introducing people to possibilities. Even if you're just scanning through, you see, okay, these are random generation tables. I could get any one of these. So it only needs one of those prompts to be evocative to a specific person for them to get drawn in. So they see that random generation table and they might not like the first three options, but the fourth one is like, wait, I could do something with that. And then they move on to the next generation table and they keep finding ones they like. And maybe they roll to see if they get it because they like a little bit of gambling, or they go, wait, I already know what I like. I'm just going to pick all of these because the game tells me I can choose.
Well, and you talked about that before too, that like sometimes you roll and you're like, okay, I now know that I definitely don't want that one. You know, like, sometimes you're like, oh, it's either or. And then you like flip a coin and you're like, oh, but I really didn't want that one. I actually do. Like it makes, you know.
I don't want burritos actually when I think about it.
Right. No, so, and I love having the rules after the character creation, especially because, you know, in a lot of games, you pick your character type or whatever, and there are whole sections of the rules that you'll never use. So, like, you put all of those rules that are like, oh, here's all the spell casting and all that, and it's like, okay, well, I'm not playing any kind of magic user, and now I've just, like, put all of that stuff in my brain and, like, worried about, and it's like, I will never touch those, you know?
Exactly, right? And so, like, because of that, we start off with that narrative, and so if somebody is being shown this book or picking up this book or, like, you know, the MC buys a copy and then distributes it for all of their players. And you're looking at the book, you can go like, oh, I can start to kind of draw up a character without having to read anything else in this book, right?
Right.
And then once you get through that narrative prompt thing, then we start getting into the rules. And the rules are very like step by step going broad into narrow, right? Where we start with the stats, the cornerstone of everything, because this game does not have skill, right? There's no skills for it. You just roll your stats. So you just pick these 4 stats and it's like, wait a minute. I already kind of have this worked out because one of the narrative prompts was literally how do I solve situations? And in brackets, it told me what stat I probably like. So I'm already like, oh, I know more or less how to build and everything else is a choice for me there. In addition, I keep trying to reinforce that like you decide, but I'll give you the parameters, right?
Right.
So instead of just giving you a set of like, here are your pluses and minuses that you can put, I just say, as long as they add up to +2, who cares? Like, you can put them wherever you like. If you want to have a +3 and a +2 and then, like, super negative stats, that's hilarious. Do whatever you like, man.
Right.
Have fun, right? And so, like, we want to do that. And the +2 maximum is literally, like, almost always standard in almost every Powered by the Apocalypse game.
Yeah.
All I had to do was just add them together, and I'm like, this is everywhere. I should just like cut out the middleman, you know what I mean? Don't obscure it. So I just wanted to reinforce that power of choice while still keeping like guidelines that make it easy to choose because it can be difficult. We come into after that probably the most complex part, which is edge tags and flaw tags, because there's a lot of them. Each one is pretty straightforward, though, I think, at least. I tried my best to pick names for them that, like, you say a weapon is forceful, you know what it does. It knocks things, it pushes stuff, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't take a lot to figure it out. And if you see a weapon has the grasp tag, obviously it's grabbing stuff when it hits, right? So everything is trying to build into that kind of mentality, but it also, by reading them, you start to pick up on the moves. You're already learning the rules a little bit, where it's like, wait, so if I'm clumsy, I can't parry. So now when I get to parry later, I already know that it means a very like graceful, skillful movement, right? And that was kind of the goal there, where the tags were meant to just be very evocative terms that outline to you what's going on.
Yeah.
Struggles is probably where character creation then starts to get like very granular, but not in a mechanical sense.
Yeah.
If you read through the struggles section of character creation, it's almost the opposite of the beginning, where the beginning is very like, do whatever you like. And when you get to struggles, it's like, still do whatever you like. But now you need to both focus on like how this is affecting your character and how important it is that it does affect them. But also, you need to keep in mind everyone else at the table. Because when you play a game with any kind of mental distress or traumas or difficulties, whether they be societal or personal or whatever, it's very easy for people to get like uncomfortable. Which is why this game also tries to encourage like build your characters together. None of that like I built my character, I'm coming on the game day, right? We want a session 0. And I try to not only set up that like you need to respect other people's boundaries, but every player needs to understand that's always a two-way street. If you just don't feel like you want this struggle to play out this way, the MC doesn't get to be like, well, it's my game, I want to do that, right? The MC can't be like, but I wanted a rainy duel with your dad, and it's like, okay, but I don't want my character to kill his father. Because that's weird and doesn't feel like what I'm going for with the abusive relationship dynamic here.
Right.
So that I felt was really important, because like the safety feature is part of character creation instead of it being like a side box that's like put over here, so that when you're going through character creation, you can look at the side box and be like, oh, okay. Also think about people's feelings.
Got it. Yeah. No, this is it. Yeah. There's a lot of consent that needs to happen between those struggles and sort of like ongoing conversations about those things. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the links, the last page is dedicated to links, and that's just mainly like a larger page just because there's so much possibility that comes from links. especially since I don't put a hard like level on how many you can have. An MC might do that. Like your own personal game master might be like, well, I don't want you to have like 20 links.
I can only
Don't
keep
do
track
that.
of so much.
But at the same time, if the game master is like, ooh, you just gave me a free NPC, cool, less writing for me, right?
Right.
Like, there's nothing wrong with creating kind of a web of those characters. But that's like the last stage, because the links don't just tell you who you are, but they contextualize who you are amongst everyone. Not just the party, but also NPCs and the wider web of characters that you're going to be encountering and dealing with. You have a grasp of like, who matters the most to me at the beginning? Who do I need to cultivate a relationship with? And how does everybody feel about me? You know?
Right.
And that's the last step. And then right after that, the only thing to touch on is like experience and advancement in it, because at that point, everything else is done by the character sheet. The character sheet tells you, pick 2 of these, pick 1 of these. If you're an energy weapon, you get this one, pick another one, right?
Yep.
You don't need to worry as much there. It just tells you the amount of choices you have to make and gives you the options, rather than it being like a weird puzzle to just figure out even what I need to choose.
Right. Right. Yeah. Like, do I go over here and then pick 2 from this tree over here and then that one? Yeah. No. Check a box.
So I tried my best to make it like every step is about going from that, like the seed of the character out to growing out that tree until we literally know the links, where you're literally connected to these other trees growing around you, so to speak. Right.
Yeah.
And that's how it went. But again, always with the philosophy, as much as I could in this, of less is more, because we wanted it to be a nice short book that wasn't intimidating to people who are new to RPGs.
Yeah.
So I tried my best to not make any section overstay its welcome.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I love to ask developers of the games is what they think is the biggest flaw of the character creation system for the game, but also what's one of your favorite parts?
So I think my favorite part is probably rolling for the relationships between the players. I think every RPG on Earth should at least have a section talking about that, because I don't care what you're making. I don't care if it's like Urban Shadows where you're not even really a party, or it's like something where you are literally all soulbound together. I want to know why I am with these people. I need to know that before the game starts, because otherwise, as soon as one of them starts pissing me off, it's going to be like, why am I here? Why is my character here now? Because this guy has been a dick to me this whole time. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
And that's one of the most frustrating things to feel, because it's to some degree something you want to talk about in characters, like out of character, and to solve as players. But also at the same time, it is, in my opinion, the fact that the system just doesn't give you a guiding hand.
Like, why do I care about you? Why?
Like,
why did I not leave you behind?
If I know I'm begrudgingly stuck with someone, that's a completely different vibe than I know nothing about this other player's character and they're awful to me, right?
Yeah.
That's a very different feeling. So that's probably my favorite, is just being able to establish links between everybody right away, so that we all kind of get a vibe of like, who in the group do I like and who do I not like and why, right?
Right. And that can very much determine story from there too, of like, okay, here's why I care about this person. Okay, that affects the narrative then of like, I would do anything for them, or, like it's just somebody I know that, I don't care that much.
I think in terms of the flaw, in a way, there is a limitation to the gimmick, right? We know that we want wielders and weapons to be dealing with combat. So one of the first things I had to eliminate is it can't be ranged. Because if it is, the wielder isn't doing anything. It's just you guys shooting over and over and over again at something in the distance. Maybe the wielder focuses on moving around, but at the end of the day, it lessens the tension to such a crazy degree that it's not worth it, right? We would need to create whole different systems for ranged weapons to make the tension stay. And then we would also not be able to do a boss fight because you just need one good melee practitioner to keep the boss near them, and everybody else just shoots them to death, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
That's not going to work. That's not fun. So that was one of the things we had to cut out. So that already limits a bunch of people who want it to be a gun or a bow or a crossbow. And then in addition to that, I kind of structured the game initially. The initial thing I built was the 3 big pillars of slashing weapons, stabbing weapons, smashing weapons, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I still wanted there to be other alternatives, so I included energy and shield. And although I love energy and shield, and I think they're really unique and fun playstyles in and of themselves, they are obviously distinct. The other 3 seem to kind of like follow their own path that feels like that's the general vibe of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas energy weapons and shields are both exceptions to the rule in different ways, like almost completely opposite directions. And what that leads us into is that sometimes I do worry that if people are playing with their friends, somebody might be like, but I don't want to be an energy weapon if everybody's trying to pick a different playbook, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why I tried to make it so that like you can have overlapping playbooks without worrying about the characters themselves being too similar.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I almost feel guilty sometimes about the fact that if you pick a shield, you have to get this edge and you have to get this flaw, and then you pick more on top of that, but you are stuck with those 2 because they exist specifically to make a shield feel like a shield.
Right.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, with energy weapons, you are stuck with a move. And I tried my best to make the move a choice in and of itself so that it doesn't feel like you're stuck with it.
Right.
But it is still like, you can't be an energy weapon without that move. It just won't work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That move encompasses how an energy weapon interacts with the world at large. So if there was any limitation, I would say that I wish I had the time or ability to come up with a slightly more holistic system where those 2 didn't feel like they were singled out.
Yeah.
Although some people might see that singling out as an advantage. It might make you feel more unique for picking them.
Yeah. I like the, like the energy attacks. It's like, okay, like the elemental attack. It's like, okay, I get to pick one from this list. And it's like, I got to define those like edges right away. And it like, it made my weapon itself feel more unique because it was like, I got to like define these things about it in a way that like you didn't necessarily with your long sword. You're like, this is how it, works.
Yeah.
And yeah. I liked it, but yeah, I can see why some people would be like, no.
Right. And we're both energy weapons and completely
totally different things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And like that's part of why I kind of also wanted to embrace like, you shouldn't get every move on a single character because then why would you play the game again? And also, why would you ever have 2 people playing the same thing, right? If you get every move by the time you finish like leveling up, then it's not going to feel as much fun as like, I have constructed this very specific, interesting build. Mm-hmm. And we're going to touch on advancement in a bit, I think. But there's also an element to that that kind of evolves how it feels to build your character as you go. And that's a big part of it, is that I really just wanted it to be like, rather than trying to be as powerful as possible, the game is ultimately about like being you.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Making what choices are right for your character as you move along. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The dreaded "it's what my character would do" is embraced in these systems powered by the apocalypse.
Yeah.
And we make the game work with that like instinct.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
All right, it's time for our favorite segment, which we call our fanfic section, which is basically we pretend in our head what kind of game we would play. So like what would happen if we played a game, but we're never going to actually play it. So,
Yeah. What happens to these characters?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
so like, I know you talked about original, like just like starting sort of like in media res, like in a dungeon. So like, what do you see happening there?
So I try to encourage for MCs to do what's called the intro dungeon, right? A dungeon which is more about the anxieties and fears that are being driven in their given community rather than any one specific character. And that allows us to learn the mechanics and still engage with something and come out of it the other end slightly more respected as well. So my thought was, in Media Res, kind of like we open literally just on all three of them have been dropped into like a pit. Like, this is a small village. They don't have a jail, right? Most places in medieval times will not have a jail or a dungeon. So they just dug a really big hole that they throw the witches in, and they only lower down ladders when they're going to burn them or do something about it, right? So we've all been dropped in there, but because of the obvious paranoia and anxiety and fears that are playing to contribute to a witch hunt, both by the victims and by the perpetrators, that hole has just sunk into the earth and become this like underworld network dungeon in the literal sense. Like a dungeon, like we're being attacked by manacles and burning like rods and strange little goblin creatures that look like jailers. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, we're these three characters. We're all pretty much aware of each other, but none of us are friends. But also, we need to get out of here.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So how do you, I don't know if talked so much about it, but like, how do we decide like who is being a weapon and not being
Ultimately, that one is one of the ones that's left a little bit more open. But one of the fun things about it is you don't need to decide until you reach the boss. So an intro dungeon will usually just be traversal and one boss at the end, right?
Okay.
Because all of us can fight as ourselves during the traversal. So we can have this kind of bumbling start where all of us are trying to fight our way through the dungeon and we're wielding ourselves and we know what we're doing because they're us, right? But the way that the traversal works is that every time you get a success, you hold 1 point in a pool of points. If you get that points to 3, you can confront the boss. But if you get it to 2, you can also just leave. So we could go through the dungeon and get 2 hold that way. And then we could go, we've been hurt too much, or we don't know each other well enough to want to confront the boss yet.
Right.
We're going to escape. Right? And maybe there's a secret tunnel that people didn't know about that we get our way out of. Or if we're doing really well, we can snowball it and be like, we could go for 1 more hold. And if we get that last point, we can stop this, right? Because we're vibing. All of us are getting along. We're getting past some of our issues. But when we decide to do that, now we do have to decide who's wielding, right?
That's interesting.
Now, my mentality from what we know about our characters is I think Amelia would be wielding. I think it would be Lilith.
All right.
Because Lilith is like the natural enemy to this situation of the witch hunt. Like you are embodying like what they say they're hunting to begin with. And you are not bad.
Right.
Right? So like the idea of you taking up staff and sword and going full witch Gandalf on the boss as our first big boss fight, it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Because my character is really out of place here because he should be in a position of privilege where he's not at risk of being hunted.
Yeah.
But that's
He's
not
like,
how witch hunts actually work.
How dare my dad not come save me from this witch pit?
Right.
Yeah. And then meanwhile, I feel like with Ryan, not only is your character conflict averse, right? But also the Cal is like, in addition to that, probably is one of the characters out of the 3 who most knew that at some point this was probably going to happen to him.
Right.
Yeah.
He's a wizard. You know? Like at some point there were going to be some people throwing me in a pit.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And he is very go with the flow. So Lilith, we know Lilith, she hits. She's hefty. She knows what she wants. She knows she's like, she might not know what she's frustrated with, but she's angry, right? So she's like, yeah, I want to slap this boss around, right? You're going with the flow. And I'm like, well, I want to get out of here. And honestly, it would be better if this whole thing just stopped because then this would be a lot less confusing. So let's do it, right?
Right.
And I think that would be our first big boss fight, is the 2 of us playing weapons and Amelia playing Lilith as a wielder.
Yeah.
Because I think that dungeon would be most relevant to her.
Yeah.
Whereas if the dungeon was like Under My Dad's Church was our intro dungeon, and it's actually about the evil secrets he has, it would make most sense for Diego to be the wielder, right?
Yeah.
So that's generally how it's supposed to work. And it can be a little bit easier when you have only 2 players or when you have 4, obviously.
Yeah.
Right.
Because then it's not like most people are weapons. It's exactly half. But in the case of this, we just need to narrow it down to that one player who's like the most invested in defeating this dungeon.
Yeah.
They're the wielder.
Got it.
Absolutely.
And then you just use like whatever moves the 2 weapons have. Is that like, okay.
Yeah. There's a few weapon moves that come with your weapon type that also affect your wielder side, but not all of them. And generally speaking, the weapons are the ones doing the mechanical heavy lifting while the wielder is doing the narrative heavy lifting in the battles, right?
Cool. Yeah.
If I were going to draw up an enemy, I feel like it would be a like pyre golem. Like it would be literally, there's a big pyre with a bunch of like, if we're going really dark with it, we can have burnt corpses around it. If not, it's just the pyre.
Right.
But it's the stake coming out of the pyre, lots of flames, and then you just see like all of the kindling forms into burning arms and it stands up. And that's our first boss where we have to fight the pyre itself, you know?
Absolutely.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's
perfect. Obviously, it can have like fire moves and sweep attacks that can hit all of us that cause fear, you know? And it would just be a really interesting battle, but also a straightforward one. Because usually in the intro dungeon, we want a boss with only like 2 traits, which means if we just keep succeeding, it only takes 4 rolls to kill it.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
So,
yeah. I love that as an intro for all of us. Like, that's perfect. Perfect.
But where do we go after?
Yeah, I'm very interested, like what the downtime looks like for this group. Like we passed the trials and tribulations of that first dungeon and possibly more. And it's like, where do we hang out? And where do we have those conversations?
Yeah, I feel like as the MC, right? Like if I was being the MC for this group and Diego was played by somebody else, my first thought would be that, well, you've defeated the dungeon that literally represents the paranoia leading to the witch hunt. So the witch hunt dies down. Right? Maybe we're if we want to keep things lighter, maybe we were the first actual victims. And as a result, the actual, like, nobody's died yet. And everybody's like, okay, maybe we went too far throwing those 3 into the hole. Right?
Yeah.
So everything calms down for a while. And then what the game can become from that point is not only all of us like bonding afterwards of like, hey, you really saved my ass back there. I appreciate that. But also from there, it becomes kind of like we can start to investigate, well, why did the witch hunt even start happening? What's causing it? And then maybe, for instance, if it's like plague, right? Like there's a plague on the local crops and that caused everyone's anxiety and then people blamed it on witches. Maybe the crops are the next dungeon. The plague represents the dungeon that we're fighting, and we're fighting a mixture of like rotting food, but also like literal representations of the disease.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And like the idea is from there, you start going through like solving the town's problems. And obviously, because although the dungeons are psychic and mental and stuff like that, they're also literal. Everybody in the setting should typically know they exist and know you cleared them. So they're going to appreciate that.
Yeah.
And the town isn't going to witch hunt you guys back into the hole.
Right.
Yeah. I'm interested
really
in like what everybody's sort of like personal dungeon would
journey.
Be. Yeah. Like, well, because, you talked about like, uncovering secrets under the church and all that kind of stuff. So I'm like interested in what, like, Ryan, what do you think your like personal...
It's got to be something about conquering that fear of conflict, right?
Right.
And what does that like look like? Is it like a series of debates or
yeah,
or is it like an old battlefield where all of the enemies are like undead killed soldiers, and that you just know what the cost of long-term conflict and violence is?
Oh yeah. I like the thought of like having to confront like what conflict can cause and like trying to get past that in a way that, you know, I don't get lost in.
I also like the idea, though, of potentially having to fight some kind of like thing that like really is bad. And so it's, you know, you get to a point where it's like sometimes you need conflict because conflict is the correct action here because somebody does need to fight this thing. We can't just let it.
Maybe your boss is like your final boss is literally the first accuser of the witch hunt. It needs to be about Cal being the one to be like, no, you are a terrible person and you need to be stopped, like straight up.
And like the reality, like especially we talked about like you feeling like, well, I guess I was going to get witch hunted at some point. And then like kind of coming to terms with the fact that like, no, I didn't. It wasn't an inevitability. Like you chose to do this to me. And I'm allowed to be in conflict with that.
The fight against injustice requires a conflicting hand.
Right.
At times.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. I like the juxtaposition of that and like our character bonding times as well, because like at first Lilith and Cal are going to be butting heads, right? Because of that conflict that we had set up. And like over time having to, constantly be kind of like going back to that, having the reminder of that and dealing with that conflict head on and eventually healing from that.
Yeah.
Definitely helps make that sort of battle, that sort of choice much more weighty and interesting.
Right. Yeah. I'd also be interested in like there being times where we did like just leave the dungeon, even though like Lilith didn't want to because of your conflict thing. And then I think like blaming you for that, but also the realization that like you can't fight every battle either.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to recuperate. Sometimes you need comfort. Right.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes like there's a larger fight that needs to be, like this wasting our time on all of these little itty bitty fires when like there's a bigger thing that we need to put out, Yeah.
What do we think about Lilith then? What would be her personal?
Well, yeah, I mean, because like so much of my anxiety is around like sort of this system and like
maybe yours is a castle.
Yeah. Are we fighting the castle?
Like we're besieging a castle as a dungeon.
Yeah.
It's like the battlements going up and we have to keep climbing higher and higher to the direct source. And at the end, you fight like the king. Maybe even like, you ever see that Thomas Hobbes Legion thing? Where it's like a king and he's made up of all of the people he rules over?
Oh.
Yeah. That could be an interesting boss concept, you know?
Yeah.
Where it's literally he's using them as like bludgeoning tools and limbs and things like that.
Yeah. Ooh, I really like that.
Almost feels like a near final boss for like the campaign too, right?
Yeah.
Where we're trying to effectively fix and heal the kingdom itself.
Yeah. Like Lilith could definitely be one of the final ones. And it could be like, usually the way it works is that the further in you get, the more that there will be like mini bosses, like bosses before the final boss of the specific dungeon.
Yeah.
And the bosses at the very end, I mentioned that the intro boss will have like 2 traits, right? But usually a final boss will have like 5. Which means that even if you're doing perfect, you have to get 10 successes in a row to fully kill it off quickly without repercussions.
Yeah.
Right? And that can be really difficult. So it can be a really long battle. So we would probably have like a good chunk of like 4 or 5 bosses even before we fight the king. And those could be all of the authority figures that have been villainized over the course of the campaign.
Yeah.
Coming back, including the father, the priest father.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of them's your dad.
Yeah.
Yep.
So like yours could be definitely like the culminating dungeon because your struggle is the broadest of all of the struggles we're dealing with. The one that pertains to everything happening in the game, right? Whereas I think with Diego, we did mention that it could be under the church. And I think that what would make a lot of sense is that because Diego's struggle is supposed to be a like loose and not quite fully formed sense of self, I think that it comes down to that issue of like, he's raised in the church, but he also knows his dad is like a scumbag who has a position of authority in it. And in addition to that, he is a weapon, one of the people that gets roped into this witch hunt.
Yeah, exactly.
So very like queer, raised as Catholic kind of vibes, right?
Yeah.
And that the dungeon could be like pushing through, and each boss could be a like over exaggerated version of something he could have dealt with. Like one of them is like a ridiculously like harmful weapon creature. That is how, like, even though he's proud of being a weapon, he's still scared to reveal because he thinks people will see him like that.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, another one could be like a flagellant, like those dudes who whip themselves and whatever, representing kind of like the religious fervor. And then the final fight could be almost like he's just fighting like an alternative version of himself if he had been accepted by his dad.
Yeah.
Oh.
And where he needs to put an end to that being like a fantasy of his to really come into his own. He needs to stop thinking about like being split between being himself and being what his dad wants him to be, and just becoming himself and completely cutting that off entirely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I love that.
So that would probably be like a more middle or possibly even before Cal's dungeon.
Yeah.
We could face that one down, and then he comes out of it like, I know who I am now. You know what I mean?
Oh, I love that. That's so good.
That's so good.
Yeah. So that's how we would theoretically construct the game, basically. Yes. And one of the other things that I actually put in, actually, I don't know if it's present in this. It might just be in dual wield, but for anybody watching, here's a hack. If you have the right group for it, you can theoretically play this game without a designated MC. You can just make it that whenever you enter a dungeon, take one person out of the party and they MC that dungeon.
Yeah.
Oh,
like, whoever would have the least character involvement with the dungeon could run that dungeon, right?
That's interesting.
And then from there, you just go with the party of just like, if it was the three of us doing a like round robin kind of MCing thing, then we only have to have two people in the dungeon at any given time.
Nice.
That's interesting. Very cool. I feel like my character would probably near the end have some sort of like put myself in harm's way to save Amelia's character sort of thing.
That would be lovely. Yeah.
I think that'd be pretty poetic. And like, I'm very curious. I don't want to define it here, I don't think, but like, would there be actual romance? Is this fully platonic? Like I would love to see how that would develop
how it
throughout as well.
Yeah.
Because I could see it going either way pretty easily.
Yeah. Usually as like a player, I would assume to just base it off of the chemistry. So like the bond move forces us to converse in character and work something out, come to some kind of conclusion, come to some kind of like benefit for the group. And so like, if we just found that me and Amelia's character have a really good riffing thing going, right? Then maybe those characters do hook up in some way. Or maybe it might be more like my character is like a little ball of anxiety who doesn't know who he is. And your character's like the opposite. He knows exactly who he is, Ryan. But they are just like everything else. Don't like, I'm not going to try to define it, right?
Yeah.
I know who I am,
and everybody else can just be whatever.
Well, my character is like, wait, where do I fit in this, right? So maybe your energy would be soothing to Diego. And so Diego might develop a crush, right?
Yeah.
Or you two might have the straight up enemies to lover, like we're button heads.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's just like, you know what? We're really complementary when you think about it.
Yep.
I do love the thought of like a 3-player polyam sort of setup here as well, because it's like you've got all those feelings between every character, and then that makes that whole dual wielding thing like even more significant, it feels like at that point.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
given that the system uses the asymmetrical, like, call and return mechanics of Powered by the Apocalypse, right? If we all constructed the final dungeon together, it could be that the final dungeon is the only one where dual wielding happens. Where up until that point, one person runs a dungeon and then two people go in and use one weapon at a time. But then as the group is fully realized and they're like a throuple, and they go into that final dungeon, then it's Lilith wielding both of the boys and just like, I say the boys, I know that.
Yeah.
Right.
I know Cal is not necessarily just a boy, but you know
very
what I'm saying.
fluid. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
And like, and that could be the grand finale where they fight the king in their first dual wielding, everybody working in tandem kind of way.
Yeah. I do like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Oh my goodness.
Good. All right. Should we jump into our final section?
Yep.
All
Final
right.
segment.
All right. Ryan, why don't you say it? Because I'm not going to say
Let's
another
take it
pun.
up a level.
Take it up a level. Take it up a level.
I will not.
I should just change the color of that so I say this part all the time.
Yeah, just you say take it up a level. Yep. So let's talk about character advancement. Mechanically, how does it work? I know there's advances listed on the character sheets.
Yeah. There are technically 3 possible tiers of advancement. Mechanically, the way it generally works is anytime you roll a 6 or less, which is a full-fledged failure, you get an experience point. There's also just a mention of like, if you want, you can also easily make a kind of end of session game move if you want to, where, for instance, if you defeated a boss, you might get an extra experience point or something like that. But generally, by default, the way the game works is you learn from your mistakes, right? And fundamentally, it's just every time you get 5, you get an advance. But the 3 tiers of advancement are there's basic advances, there's grand advances, and then there's what you could call like end game if you want it, right? Most games will never go to end game, so it's not really in the book, but it's kind of taken as a given by a small detail to the character sheet design. You may have noticed that the harm track is only 5 boxes, but then there are 5 more in gray.
Gotcha.
So anything past those 10 advances that you're supposed to take from basic to grand, once you get past those, every advance you get can give you a new harm box to make you a sturdier wielder.
Okay.
But by default, we want to structure the game around wielders only having 5 harm most of the time. So the basic advances are very straightforward. You just get +1 to any stat, is the first 2 that you can take. You can take them in any order, though, just for the record. You can gain a new edge from your weapon type, so the ones listed on your sheet. And then you can gain a weapon move from your weapon type, and then another weapon move from any weapon type.
Yeah.
So already we see that, like, what you would typically call multi-classing is encouraged in the system. Like, I might decide that when my character, Diego, gets up a level, I might take a weapon move from the energy playbook because I've been learning from you guys, and I'm getting my view on things from you guys, and now I become a flaming sword.
Yeah.
Right? And I just get one ability that adds like something related to fire based on one of your moves, right?
Love it.
When we get to the grand advances is when you've taken all 5 basic advances, you go into grand advances. And these start getting a lot looser. There's gain any edge that you desire. So any edge that any weapon can take, you can take. You can theoretically make your sword work like a shield in the grand advanced category, right? Likewise, you get gain a new weapon move from any type or write your own with MC's approval.
Ooh.
Which, Powered by the Apocalypse games are always a little bit like spicy about like, if you feel like the moves don't cover everything, make your own. Like most of them are like that to begin with, right? And we left a blank space at the bottom right-hand side of the character sheet for such a move that you would need to write in or a move you're copying from another playbook. But then the last 3 have no mechanical aspect whatsoever, but are narrative, but they're really, really big. So 1 is reconcile fully with someone you hurt or someone who hurt you.
Your dad.
Then the second is change the heart of one of your greatest enemies forever. Because in my opinion, a Zuko is always welcome at the table. And then the last one is gain a turf or following, a location or faction that is all your own and loyal to you, with narrative benefits to match that you can utilize in free play, which is the downtime.
Ooh.
Nice.
So, like, this is very straightforward for Lilith, for instance, that could be the last advance she takes before we storm that castle, where she brings the weight of the kingdom behind her. The common people have rallied behind her. But with you and me, we might do different ones. You might found a wizard archive, right? I might decide that my character is going to start like a mercenary band because that's what he's decided he's going to do. Or Diego might even do something else where he almost creates like a black sheep convent where all of the people who have been wronged or didn't belong in the church but were kind of forced into it can go and live together, right? There's a variety of ways that you can interpret that, but the point of it is that those three are there for the players to put their mark on the fiction, not just in the sense that like this is built around you, but now you get to choose something happens in the story and no one gets to veto it, right?
Yeah. So
you can be like, I always thought that serial killer was kind of a flat character. He's good now. Figure it out. And so like, there's a lot of fun that can come from that, and the game can get very transformative. And the point of it is that if you're getting to the point where you're taking these grand advances, you guys have been playing for a while.
Right.
You shouldn't be so dug into like, this game is only one thing, because you've probably already experienced most of what you planned for the game.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. Yeah. Oh,
so those are the advances. I don't know how we would want to do it, though, because, well, most advancement systems either, like, mandate what your next level is going to do, or they have, like, each level is multiple things. This is Powered by the Apocalypse game, and you only get, like, one thing that you get to choose.
Yeah.
So maybe what we should do that I think would be most interesting is we could almost do it a little bit more like a fan fiction thing, where maybe each of us should talk about if we take a weapon move from a different playbook and what that represents for us, right? And then maybe we should talk about a grand advance, and we talk about one of the three narrative ones and which ones we would want to see the hardest.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think like my first instinct, right, is taking a move from the shield playbook.
I was
have like a defensive kind of
because like one of my favorite like tropes in like magic things that you have is the like the magic wall of force that
field
blocks whatever, right? And so like you've got big energy beam coming at you, wall of force comes up, energy beam deflects around the party.
Right.
That's just such a cool visual. And I'm such a sucker for whenever that happens, probably because of the ending of season 1 of Sailor Moon. But like, yeah, the defensive move is like something that my weapon is missing completely, right? So I would love to be able to take one of those moves. To be able to do
that I see right away that I think would make the most sense for that is there's a shield move called 9 Lives, where it's whenever you or your wielder successfully defeat an enemy or damage a boss's trait using your shield weapon profile, in this case it would just be your weapon profile, your wielder becomes immune to harm until they roll a miss. So that would be like the persistent force field, but I think what you're describing is actually Wall Raiser.
Yes.
Which is you can spawn a barrier or barricade from whatever material the ground is made from. Roll core. On a hit, you create a barrier large enough for the whole team of allies to hide behind. On a 10+, it will remain until someone gets a miss while using it as cover. On a 7 to 9, it will only protect you from a single hazard or enemy reaction.
Yeah.
But it's just like, boom, magic wall. Everybody's protected. That a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would definitely be Wall Raiser at that point. My goodness.
It's very wizardy, so it works very well. You just have to ignore the first little bit of flavor there where it says slam your ridge into the ground. You don't need to do that. Let's see though. What would make sense for what are you thinking for Lilith?
So there's one in the blunt playbook called Death Spiral that I really like.
Yeah.
Whenever enemies or boss traits swarm or surround you and your wielder, you may opt to spin in a whirlwind to strike out at any and all of them. When you do so, roll plus heft. On a 10+, you knock them all back, whether or not you have the forceful edge, and damage them all as appropriate. On a 7 to 9, you either knock them all back or you damage them all. And on a miss, you fly out of your wielder's hands or are separated from the group. I just like the idea of somebody just like spinning around with a whip, like just like
Yeah, and you can either picture it as like holding it out and spinning in place, or you can picture it as whirling the whip around like that.
Right.
And it just plows through everything.
I like to think about it as like rhythmic gymnastics when they have the ribbons and you like twirl it around yourself and up and around. And it's like a whole little acrobatic dance thing.
Which is especially scary with you because you're a hefty whip, which is not a common thing. That is a really rare choice for a player to make. So
yes, and also like lots of dark energy radiating out of there too. So just terrifying.
I can imagine like you do all the cool twirls and it creates like this energy around you, and then one crack in the air and they all go flying.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
It might be a little bit less like exciting, but that's kind of fun. Part of the fun with Diego in my mind anyway is that like it's kind of like some people might consider him lame, but he's very useful and helpful, and I just want him to play a good bit part. If you catch my drift,
he's like the basics in your closet. It's like they're sturdy and they're great to have. They're not the most exciting, but like they serve a purpose.
But you'd be so sad to see them gone,
right?
Like, you know?
Right? Yeah.
And so because of that, I think he is going to take an energy move, but not the one you'd expect.
Oh.
He's going to take Positive Surge. When you or your wielder defeats an enemy or damages a boss's trait that inflicted fear on you, you clear your fear tracks.
Ooh. I love
It's about that kind of thing of like he overcame and now he can be the positivity for other people and make them feel more sure of themselves.
Yeah. Well, because we're all just like so proud of you. We're like, yes, this is great. And now we're all amped up. Because we're like, look at Diego,
and we can picture
you did
it as
it.
kind of like when you damage it, there's like a gleam across the blade. Like the energy is subtle. It's just like a little ray of light that like, makes you feel, feels safe and everything, right?
I love it.
Yeah. And then we can talk about those grand advances, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think would be most important to you on that front?
Gosh.
I feel like, for me, I don't think Diego would reconcile with his father. It would probably be something more like his mother, because in my mind, his mother is one of those well-meaning people who made a bunch of choices that hurt him, right?
Right.
And so she still loves him and all that stuff, but like she needs to realize she was wrong, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas I think change the heart of one of your greatest enemies forever. I think I would want to change his dad's heart, but not in a way where he becomes a good guy. I think I'd want to change his heart in the way where he leaves.
Oh
He stops being a problem. Like he realizes just how awful everything he's doing is, and then he exiles himself in shame, and we never see him again. Do you know what I mean? Like he's off and he's a hermit now.
Yeah.
Kind of vibe. But like, because that's to me so much more of a complete victory than just beating him up in a dungeon.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think that would be my choice for him, is like the specifically exiling his father would be one of the grand advances I would be working towards and really excited for.
I would go with reconcile fully. And it would probably be with Lilith at that point. Like this is where we finally bury the hatchet effectively and get past all of the past like irritation with one another. I think that would work out really well.
Slowly brought the two heads into kiss since you were looking down. Now kiss.
Let's see here.
I don't know if I have a greatest enemy like off the bat though, right?
I mean, like yourself?
Since I'm I mean, it's probably like somebody that represents injustice, right? Something like, because it's a little bit more nebulous in Callie's life because like, you know, they're pretty low key, low energy, and like chill.
You might accumulate one over the course of the game, though.
Yeah,
True.
that's what I'm thinking.
Like, if I'm emceeing this game again, I'm probably not going to start us off with it, but I would introduce the traveling witch hunter, which was a huge problem in Germany during the medieval period, where they were just serial killers. Like, that's what they were.
Yeah, they were
went
like
town to
glorified.
town.
Yeah, they had like credentials technically given to them by, but they just did whatever they wanted with it.
They would create witch hunts where one didn't exist. They went around convincing people to kill their neighbors, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like, I think someone like that, who isn't just a character, like, bathed in conflict, but is one who makes it for what is just to enrich himself.
Right.
Because if you didn't know, a lot of people don't know this, but if a witch dies, their kids don't inherit their stuff. Their accuser does.
Oh,
that was one of the most horrifying realities of the witch hunt, is that most people were doing it to take things from people.
I have land grabs and stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah. You can get rid of that neighbor you hate and get his farm. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing, right? Or sometimes the church or like the official would take it. But that's how these traveling witch hunters made their money. They would get all of this stuff, and then they would auction it off to the community or to somebody else. And then they take all the gold and move on to the next town and get paid to kill someone else who is innocent.
Wow.
Yep.
So, like, I feel like that's like a perfect enemy for Callie.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so, especially, you know, being the sort of like conflict avoidant kind of thing. And then be like, these people came and like made up conflict where it didn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Heath Ledger's The Joker is actually a religious official, it turns out, from the medieval period.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you thinking for Lilith? Are you having trouble?
I'm trying to decide. Like, I feel like the idea of like
you can discuss multiple.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the idea of like gaining a following is very interesting as like sort of like an uprising, like now we've created a communist collective, sort of like you know, of like this sort of revolutionary group is very interesting to me. And then especially like, you know, when we go into that final fight to, you know, like defeat the king and, you know, all of this, like to have sort of a backing of like, here's the replacement at least of like, you know, it's not just me being mad at the king. It's like we have an established group of people to fight this system. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is the heart that you're changing the system itself at that point?
Could be.
Are you changing the heart of feudalism to be more community based?
I mean, keep in mind, change the heart of one of your greatest enemies forever doesn't need to be positive. It never says to a good degree.
Right.
Like, you could make it that a grand advance for Lilith is that it finally accelerates and the king goes full, like, fascist, essentially, on us, right?
Also, I'd like to point out that we could change his heart from beating to not beating. That's an option.
My final weapon form is a guillotine.
There you go.
Didn't say how it's changed. I mean, that could be like sort of like the, you know, like that last like power grab of like, okay, now that you've, you know, built this following and like this people rising up, that it's like that last, you know, sort of like, let's institute martial law. Let's, you know.
Yeah. Like, because the grand advances don't need to be something good for your character. They need to be something the player wants to see.
Right.
Right. So if you just feel like, you know, if you're just like, I'm sick of this, I don't want to go and like burn down a castle when they're just sitting there being jerks with taxes, right?
Right.
I want it to feel more righteous. I want it to be like there's a very direct indignation. So I've decided that the king's marching out with some Templars, some Teutonic knights who are going to burn down the countryside, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
you know?
it's an interesting take on advancement, because it's like, yeah, it's your advancement, but you're directing the narrative with this advancement instead of like, my character's causing the narrative to change. right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as like one of the last dropping names thing, that was also partially inspired by City of Mist's approach to advancement, where they have what's called horizontal advancement. And I often found that to be some of the most interesting, where in City of Mist, you can have an advancement where instead of you gaining more power, you're losing something and gaining something different that's equally as powerful, right?
Yeah.
And although I didn't institute that in this game, I still wanted to keep it mostly vertical advancement. I was like, I don't want advancement in this game to end off on just getting
now
more
you are
stuff.
gods. Yeah. Yeah, because you get to that level where it's like, okay, nothing's fun anymore because like I can do literally everything.
Yeah, I think D&D first edition was like up to level 10. And then after level 10, anytime you would have leveled up, you would do something different, like gain a castle. Or start a thieves guild or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And ever since I heard about that, one, it was another thing I got furious at Wizards of the Coast for getting rid of, because that's way more interesting than just being the ultimate adventurer ever. Because now also continuing to be an adventurer at that level is a choice you're making, right?
Yeah.
You're refusing to settle down. But the other thing is that I really like the idea of like, after a certain point in the game, like we want our ending.
Yeah.
So why don't we get to choose it?
Yeah.
Why is it always subject to the GM?
Well, and advancing is just moving forward. It doesn't necessarily mean moving up. You know,
Right.
Exactly.
Like those don't have to be the same
And
thing.
like, I'm not going to say anything too specific about it, but I once played a game that had a really disappointing ending because the GM just decided it would just end there. And it was like a MacGuffin hunt, and then we got the MacGuffins, and then Cthulhu showed up, and we punched him with the MacGuffins, and then it ended.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it was like, really? That's it? Like, we don't get to say what happens, I guess? And he's like, well, you can talk about when you ascend to godhood and stuff. And I'm like, okay. But like at the same time,
Did
it was
I even want that?
That's our last session? I didn't want to fight I didn't even want to fight Cthulhu. My character was Native American in that game. He doesn't care about Cthulhu. So, you know.
Yeah, I like that it gives you that kind of narrative control to be like, this is what I want. This is what I want my story to be.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And yeah, if you're just the type of group that wants to keep playing even after all that has occurred, you can keep going and just do that last little run of like, now we have 10 harm instead of 5, and we can clear multiple dungeons in a session.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. Amazing.
So yeah.
Oh, this is a fantastic game.
It's so good.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Well, Maso, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Life on the Edge. This was delightful.
It was a blast. It was a lot of fun. I think we all have been sitting here longer than we expected to.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right. But it was enjoyable, you know? You don't notice it go that fast.
Absolutely. Can you remind everyone where they can find you online and the sorts of things you have going on right now?
Yep. So again, you can find me online as Trumoi, Trumoi, and that'll be on like itch.io, on Tumblr. You can technically find me on Reddit. I'm even on Discord that way. So if you see Trumoi kicking around a Discord, it's me. And in terms of what I've got going on, we'll see, I guess. I am writing another system. And it's a bit of an interesting thing because it is a sort of powered by the apocalypse, sort of forged in the dark game, but it's one that adds critical miss and successes to the system with snake eyes and devil's dice where you roll 2 6s. But another major thing about it is that I love the boss system of like openings and damage rather than tracking damage as slots so much that I've been designing a system that applies it to the player characters too.
Ooh.
And the first game that I'm building in it, right now the working title for it is Scaring Crows. And it's fundamentally a game about like monster hunting, but you play as marginalized members of your community who hunt monsters because you have basically nothing else available to you to do. And
This is
in
like the
addition to
leftover
that,
jobs that nobody wants. Is like monster hunting.
basically.
Okay. All right.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm here for it.
And the monsters are horror monsters, not like D&D monsters. Like it's like things go bump in the night type monsters. And the whole setup of the game, without giving too much away, is that the game starts by setting up a binary of light and dark. And then everything about it is going to be trying to structure it around the longer you play, the less you believe that's true.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
It's heavily inspired by Dark Souls and similar games from Software, where they're really good at that. They'll like set up a like, you're going on this quest and you got to go, link the first flame to save everybody. And then as you go through it, you're like, do I even want to do this? Because the people who linked the flame initially are genocidal.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I want to create that kind of a vibe where it's like, I want to create a game where unfolding lore and discovering that your preconceptions are not true is fundamentally baked into how everything works.
I like that. Well, yeah, everybody knows that that's, I love gray areas. It's a constant theme on this show is that like, I love morally complicated gray areas. It's
Yeah. If you guys want, I can send you the cool little diagram I made to try to explain the like, how like it's the map of power essentially, but it's very abstract and weird.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so much fun.
And it's also going to have a lot of Bossk mythology baked into it as the kind of unifying line. So there's a lot of stuff with dreams and nightmares, and a lot of the things are going to have proto-Bossk runes as like symbols and stuff like that used throughout. And the term scaring crows comes from a weird Bossk folklore idea of scarecrows that hunt monsters and protect you from monsters. And that's what they're called, kusho, and that's what the protagonist's job is.
Oh,
like
very
you
cool.
are considered less than human, but you are the protectors of the community.
Amazing.
Oh yeah. Well, call us when the game is done, and you can come talk with us.
Sounds like a good October game.
Yes.
Amazing.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us. This was a blast. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Great to be on.
Call to action.
Yeah, like that.
I am still delighted by this game. I was listening back to the episodes, and it is just such an interesting concept. Like the amount of trust that you have to have, like putting yourself into these character shoes, to wield another character as a weapon in battle and in these life or death situations. It really is an interesting approach to relationship building in RPGs, and it was really interesting learning about this game. And the fact that it's delivered through things like Steam is just an interesting way to distribute an RPG PDF form. So this game is pretty fantastic. You can go check it out. We've got links in our show notes. But yeah, I really happy to have Maso on, and really happy we got to cover a game like this, especially a game about relationships in the month that celebrates relationships usually, especially here in the US. So, but before we let you go for the day, we do have some calls to action. So first up, just a reminder that new member of the network, Dillin, is now the brand new host of the namesake podcast for our network, the One Shot Podcast. They are currently playing through I Have the High Ground with James Tomato, and it's pretty fantastic so far. Definitely check it out if you have a chance to. We'll have a link to the first episode in the show notes. On our side of things, if you wanted to get in touch with us on the show, there's a lot of great ways to do this. The best way is to head to contact.charactercreationcast.com and find all of our social media links there, as well as a contact form to email us directly. Otherwise, you can join us on Discord at discord.charactercreationcast.com and be able to chat with us in real time. Finally, if you want to throw direct comments at us per episode, we have our episodes on YouTube now at youtube.charactercreationcast.com under the podcast tab. You can also leave comments there, or you can even comment on each episode over on Spotify's mobile app. Not sure why it's not on the desktop app, but it's there. Next up, a reminder that we are still in need of your assistance over on our Patreon. We are covering our costs, but with very little wiggle room currently. If you want to help us out, this is the absolute best way to do so. If you sign up for the $5 level or higher, you can get some really cool swag like custom C3 dice from ChessX, a personalized thank you card written by Amelia, and a whole bunch more. You even get early release episodes, which would let you hear most of next month's series right now. If you go a bit higher to the $10 level, you get to join our Sticker of the Month Club, where Amelia designs a new sticker every month, and we send them out to our patrons at this level. If we can get to $200 a month, then we can start offering yearly discounts for folks too. So it'd be really helpful all around. In addition to all of that, we'll thank all of our patrons every single episode like we're about to do right now, starting with Lieutenant and DJG, aka Tigranosaurus. You rock. Thank you. Eric Bonds and Daryl Holiday II, thanks. Shadim Cabal and the Shyest Barbarian, many thanks to you. Benjamin Sweeney and Lorcan McGinnis, we're happy to have you here with us. Thank you. Thank you to Rob Fletcher and Kevin Brown. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you to Tentacle Duck and Cole McCallum. We're so thankful for your support. Thank you, John Adamus and the Rockabilly Raccoons' rambunctiously Randy rocking reenactment of Regina's ragtime routine. We couldn't do this without you as well. Thanks to Carlos Salazar and Eric S. We are glad to have you with us. We appreciate your support, Ross Kinston and Ian Potmeyer. Thank you. Sorigoth and Liam G. We appreciate your support as well. Thank you. Brian Colm and the Guardian GM, thanks for making this all possible. Tom and Blue Kryptonite, many thanks to you. Danny and Nicole Trader, thank you so much. Liam Murray and Kenny, thanks for making this. Thanks for helping us make this show. Brian Kurtz and Mark E. Fair, thanks for helping us make this show as well. And Drew Owen, thanks for making all of this possible. And thank you to all of our future Patreon supporters. Your assistance is allowing us to afford making this show. And the more folks that join in, the more we'll be able to do in the future. So head on over to patreon.com/charactercreationcast to join up right now. Another way to show your appreciation and support is to leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, Spotify, or Facebook. Every 5-star review helps us out and brings us a ton of joy, but also we will read them out here and thank you personally when we do get new reviews. That's all we have for today's episode. We have a day off next week, but join us back here for the first Monday of March, where we start a brand new series with guest Haley Gordon, one half of the Story Brewers, to discuss their hit game, Fight with Spirit. Until then, take care, everyone. Stay safe, drink some water, and keep making those amazing people. We'll see you next time. Character Creation Cast is a production of the One Shot Podcast Network and can be found online at www.charactercreationcast.com. Head to the website to get more information on our hosts, this show, and even our press kit. Character Creation Cast can also be found on Twitter and Blue Sky at CreationCast, or on our Discord server at discord.charactercreationcast.com. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Bolter, and I can be found on Twitter and Blue Sky at Lord Neptune or online at lordneptune.com. Our other host, Amelia Antrim, can be found on Twitter and Blue Sky at Ginger Reckoning. Music for this episode is used with a Creative Commons license or with permission from the podcast they originated from. Further information can be found within the show notes. Our main theme music is Hero Remix by Steve Combs and is used with a Creative Commons license. This podcast is owned by us under Creative Commons. This episode was edited by Ryan Bolter. Further information for the game systems used and today's guests can also be found in the show notes. If you'd like to support our show, find us on Patreon. Get access to bonus episodes, exclusive merch, and much more at patreon.com/charactercreationcast. Thanks for joining us. And remember, we find that the best part of any role-playing game is character creation. So go out there and create some amazing people. We'll see you next time.